The heat in the Redemption Saloon was a physical weight, thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and the cheap perfume of the women who worked the floor. Dust motes danced in the syrupy shafts of late afternoon sun slanting through the grimy windows. At a table in the darkest corner, Lynn sat alone. Her black duster was unbuttoned, revealing the worn gun belt cinched low on her hips. Her black hat was pulled down, its brim shadowing a face that held the stillness of a predator at rest. She nursed a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid untouched, her gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving lack of emotion. She was a ghost at their feast, an unwelcome specter of something they couldn't name but deeply resented. The men gave her a wide berth, their laughter and boasts quieting whenever their eyes strayed to her corner. The women shot her looks of pure venom, a mixture of fear and contempt for the woman who wore a man's clothes and carried a man's gun with more authority than any man in the room. When the piano player struck up a clumsy waltz, a few couples shuffled onto the small dance floor. No one looked toward Lynn's corner. No one ever did. She was an island, unreachable and dangerous. Then the saloon doors swung open and Amos stepped inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted from the brutal glare of the sun. He was a man made of quiet angles and solid presence, his shoulders broad from labor, his hands calloused and capable. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who works the land, who understands patience. He wasn't shy in the way of boys who blush and stammer. His was the shyness of a man who prefers the company of the sky and the soil to the noise of other people. He ordered a beer at the bar, his back to the room, but he saw her reflection in the warped mirror behind the bottles. He saw the space around her, a vacuum of hostility. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hand never strayed far from the Colt at her hip. He saw the profound, aching loneliness she wore like a second coat. He drank his beer in 2 long swallows, set the glass down with a quiet click, and turned. The room seemed to hold its breath as he started walking, not toward the door, but toward the corner. Every eye followed him. The music faltered. He stopped in front of her table. Lynn's eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian chips, lifted to meet his. They held no warmth, only a question that was also a warning. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He had a plain, honest face, weathered by sun and work. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the saloon's clatter. He gestured with his head toward the dance floor. "Would you care to dance?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Lynn's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in her eyes. Surprise, suspicion, a ghost of something else. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the trick, the mockery. She found none. There was only a simple, direct request in his gaze. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed her chair back and stood. She moved with a liquid grace that was startling in a place so full of clumsy, brutish motion. Without a word, she allowed him to take her hand. His grip was firm and dry, the calluses on his palm a testament to his life. He led her to the center of the floor, into the circle of stunned silence. The pianist, prodded by a glare from the bartender, began to play again, his tune hesitant and uncertain. Amos placed a hand on the small of her back, right above the heavy leather of her gun belt. They began to move, a slow, awkward rotation. He wasn't a good dancer, and she was stiff with tension, but they moved together. The whole world had shrunk to the space between them, a small pocket of defiance in a room thick with judgment. He could feel the lean muscle of her back beneath the fabric of her shirt. She could feel the solid strength of his frame, a bulwark against the stares that felt like physical blows. They didn't speak. There were no words for this. It was an act that spoke for itself, a quiet rebellion against the town's unspoken laws. For one song, in the hostile heart of redemption, the outlaw and the rancher danced, and the silence around them was louder than any music. When the last chord faded into the thick air, they stopped. The silence in the saloon pressed in on them again, heavy and suffocating. Amos released her hand, but his other hand remained for a moment on her back, a brief, grounding touch. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of thanks that was also a dismissal of the gawking crowd. He turned and started for the door, and for a beat, Lynn remained on the floor, a solitary figure once more. Then, with a decisive movement, she followed him. The bat-wing doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the noise and the hate, leaving them in the relative peace of the dusty street as twilight bled purple and orange across the horizon. The air was cooler out here, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. They stood a few feet apart, the space between them charged with the unsaid. "That was a fool thing to do," Lynn said, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Amos put his hat back on, settling it on his head. "Maybe," he allowed, "but a man ought to be able to ask a lady to dance without it causing a town-wide incident." "I'm not a lady," she replied, her tone sharp, "and you know it." He looked at her then, really looked at her in the fading light. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the tension in her jaw that never seemed to release. He saw the armor she wore, and he guessed at the cost of carrying it. "You look like you could use a meal that didn't come with a side of men staring you down," he said, changing the subject. "And a place to sleep where you don't have to keep one eye open." Her hand instinctively dropped to rest on the butt of her pistol. "What's it to you?" "I have a ranch, north of here. It's quiet." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I could use an extra hand with the fences. The pay is fair, room and board included." Suspicion hardened her face. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity," he said plainly. "It's work, hard work. You look like you're not afraid of it." Lynn studied him, her gaze intense, searching. In her world, kindness was a currency for something else, a down payment on a debt she would be expected to pay. But his eyes were clear, his offer straightforward. He wasn't looking at her with the greed or lust she was used to. He was looking at her like she was a person, competent and capable. He was offering her a chance to be something other than the cornered animal in the saloon. She was tired, bone tired of running, of watching her back, of the constant, grinding vigilance. The quiet he spoke of sounded like a forgotten language. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of 100 questions. Amos looked out toward the dark shapes of the mountains. "Because nobody should have to be that alone." The simplicity of it disarmed her. It was the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She gave a short, sharp nod. "All right, rancher. I'll fix your fences." He didn't smile, but the tightness around his own mouth eased. "My name's Amos." "Lynn," she said, and it felt strange to give her name, a piece of herself she hadn't offered freely in a long time. They walked to where their horses were tied. Under the deepening indigo of the night sky, they rode out of redemption, leaving the judgment and the noise behind them. Two solitary figures moving toward a place that might, for a little while, be safe. The ranch was exactly as Amos had described it, quiet. It was a modest spread nestled in a shallow valley, a small, sturdy house and a solid-looking barn carved out of the vast, indifferent landscape. Everything about the place spoke of Amos himself, functional, unadorned, and built to last. There were no frills, only the clean lines of hard work and persistence. The house had 2 rooms. He gave her the smaller one without discussion, taking a bedroll for himself in the main room by the cold hearth. There was a quiet dignity in the way he offered her the privacy of a door, a luxury she hadn't known for months. The first days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. They rose before dawn, the air cool and tasting of dust. They drank coffee brewed black and strong, a ritual performed in near silence. Then they worked. They rode the fence line, the creak of saddle leather and the thud of the post driver the only sounds for hours. Amos worked with a steady, relentless pace, his movements efficient and sure. He expected nothing from her he didn't do himself, and he watched, without appearing to watch, as she matched his pace. Lynn was a revelation. She worked with a fierce, focused energy, her smaller frame belying a surprising strength. She coiled wire with deft, sure hands. She could anticipate what he needed before he asked for it, the hammer, the staples, a length of leather. Her competence was a language he understood better than words. In her, he saw a mirror of his own self-sufficiency, a grit that had been forged in a fire much hotter than his own. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with observation. She noticed the way he gentled his horse with a low murmur, the way his hands, so capable of force, could be surprisingly careful. He noticed the way she always positioned herself with her back to a solid object, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. She never relaxed, not completely. One evening, as they sat on the porch cleaning their tools, he saw her watching the distant ridge line, her body so tense it seemed to hum with it. "You expecting company?" he asked, his voice casual. Her head snapped toward him, her guard instantly up. "Just watching the sunset." But they both knew it was a lie. The horizon wasn't a thing of beauty to her. It was a source of threat. He didn't press. He just nodded and went back to oiling the action on his rifle. He was learning her boundaries. They were like a new fence line, sharp and clear, and he was careful not to cross them. He was giving her space, giving her time. He was giving her the quiet he had promised, and he hoped it was enough. For Lynn, the quiet was both a balm and a torment. The constant grinding labor tired her body in a way that let her sleep for a few hours at a time, but the silence gave her thoughts too much room to roam. The peace of the valley felt fragile, temporary. She felt like an imposter in this small world of order and routine Amos had built. She was a creature of chaos, and she knew, with a certainty that was a cold stone in her gut, that the chaos would find her. And when it did, it would destroy this place. It would destroy him. The thought was a new and unwelcome weight. She had never had anyone to worry about but herself. The first sign of trouble came 4 days later. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift in the landscape. 2 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun on the eastern ridge. They weren't cowboys checking on strays. They sat their horses with the stillness of wolves, watching the ranch below. Lynn saw them first. Her body went rigid, the coffee cup halfway to her lips. She set it down without a sound. Amos, following her gaze, saw them too. The peaceful morning air suddenly turned brittle. "Friends of yours?" he asked, his voice low. "I have no friends," she answered, her eyes never leaving the figures on the ridge. She was already moving, her body flowing from the porch chair into a low crouch as she slipped back inside the house. Amos followed, his own movements becoming more deliberate, more focused. The easy rhythm of the morning was shattered. He took his rifle from the pegs by the door, the familiar weight of it a grim comfort. Lynn was already at the window, her own Winchester in hand. The rifle looked like an extension of her arm. "How many?" Amos asked, his voice clipped, tactical. "2 on the ridge," she said. "Could be scouts. There will be more." Her certainty was chilling. This was a scenario she had played out in her mind 1,000 times. He saw the transformation in her. The quiet, watchful worker was gone. In her place was a soldier. Her face was a mask of cold calculation. Every ounce of fear she might have felt was burned away by a sharp, deadly focus. He felt a strange surge of admiration mixed with a cold knot of dread. He had invited this storm to his door, and now it was breaking. The riders stayed on the ridge for the better part of an hour, a silent, ominous presence. They were making a statement, letting her know she'd been found. Then, as one, they turned their horses and disappeared over the crest. They didn't ride away. They melted back into the landscape from which they had emerged. The immediate threat was gone, but the air remained thick with it. The quiet of the valley was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. Amos let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked over at Lynn. She was still at the window, her rifle held at a low ready. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the stock. "They'll be back," she said. It wasn't a guess. "I know," Amos replied. He moved to the other window, scanning the opposite direction. "We should bring the horses into the barn. Check the water barrels." His practicality was an anchor in the sudden storm of her past. He wasn't asking why they were here or who they were. He had accepted the reality of the threat without question. He had seen the riders, and he had sided with her. That simple, unspoken act of solidarity struck her with more force than the dance in the saloon. He was choosing to stand with her, to face a danger that wasn't his. He was treating it as a shared problem, a we situation. The realization settled deep inside her, a small, warm coal in the cold landscape of her fear. For the first time, she wasn't entirely alone in the fight. The rest of the day passed in a state of heightened awareness. The sun felt hotter, the shadows darker. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every bird call like a signal. They worked with a grim, silent efficiency, reinforcing the world Amos had built, turning his home into a defensible position. They boarded up the larger windows on the ground floor of the house, leaving small slits to see and shoot through. They moved sacks of grain and flour to create better cover inside. They checked their ammunition, laying out cartridges on the heavy oak table in neat, deadly rows. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. Their communication was pared down to the essential: a nod, a gesture, a quiet murmur. "Hand me the hammer." "More nails." "The north side is blind. We'll have to watch it from the loft in the barn." In their shared labor, a new kind of intimacy was forged. It was the trust of two soldiers in a trench, a bond built on competence and mutual reliance. Amos watched her move, her actions precise and knowledgeable. She knew how to calculate firing angles, how to create a crossfire. This wasn't her first fight. The knowledge settled heavily in his gut. The woman he'd asked to dance was a warrior, and he'd brought her war to his doorstep. He felt no regret, only a grim resolve. That evening they sat at the table, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows. The house was a fortress now, braced for a siege. The food on their plates was tasteless, a formality. The quiet between them was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of shared work, but the tense stillness of waiting. "You don't have to do this," Lynn said suddenly, her voice low. "This isn't your fight. You can ride out. They want me, not you." Amos stopped cleaning his pistol and looked at her. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her eyes dark pools of old fear and new guilt. "I offered you a job," he said, his voice even. "Part of that job is making sure my hand isn't dragged off my property by armed men. It's bad for business." It was a poor attempt at levity, but it was also his way of saying he wasn't leaving. It was his way of deflecting the enormity of the choice he was making. He was a man of the land. You didn't run from your land. You defended it. And she was on his land. Therefore, he would defend her. The logic was simple, unshakable. "Amos," she started, the name a soft plea. He cut her off, his tone gentle but firm. "We should get some sleep, one of us on watch at a time. I'll take the first shift." He stood, ending the conversation. He was a man who decided things slowly, but once decided, he was as immovable as the mountains that ringed the valley. He had decided to stand his ground. He had decided to stand with her. Lynn watched him take his position by the reinforced window, his rifle resting on the sill. In that moment, the debt she felt she owed him became a crushing weight. He had offered her a dance, a job, a safe place, and in return she had brought him nothing but the promise of violence and death. The attack came just after dusk, as the last light drained from the sky, leaving the valley in a deep, starless black. It wasn't a wild charge, but a coordinated assault. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides at once, the crack of rifles echoing off the valley walls. Splinters flew from the house's wooden frame as the first volley of bullets slammed into it. Amos didn't flinch. "Get down!" he barked, pulling Lynn away from the window she'd been watching. They hit the floor as another burst of shots tore through the space where she'd just been standing. The fight was on. The world shrank to the confines of the small house, to the smell of gunpowder and hot metal, the percussive roar of firearms and the hiss of lead cutting through the air. They moved in the dark, 2 shadows working in perfect, unspoken unison. He would fire a few rounds from a window, drawing their attention, while she moved to another position to pick off a target illuminated by the muzzle flash. The house groaned under the assault. A bullet shattered the lantern, plunging them into near total darkness, lit only by the strobing blasts from their own guns and those of the attackers outside. During a brief lull in the shooting, as the attackers regrouped, the voice of their leader cut through the night, arrogant and cold. "Lynn, we know you're in there. The man from the Black Creek Mining Syndicate sends his regards. Just give us the ledgers, and we'll let the rancher live." Amos froze, crouched beside the hearth. He looked over at the shape of her in the darkness. Black Creek Mining. A name synonymous with corruption. A corporate beast that had been chewing up smaller ranches and claims all over the territory, backed by hired guns and bought-off lawmen. It wasn't a bounty. It wasn't a personal grudge. This was something far bigger and far more dangerous. He was hit then. A stray round, fired blindly at the house, punched through the wall and tore a burning line across his arm. He grunted in pain, stumbling back. Lynn was at his side in an instant. "Amos!" Her voice was sharp with a fear she hadn't shown for herself. In the dim light from a crack in the boarded window, she saw the blood soaking his sleeve. The sight seemed to break something in her. The soldier's mask crumbled, replaced by a raw, desperate guilt. "This is my fault," she whispered, her hands hovering over the wound, unsure what to do. "They're here for me. For this." She reached inside her shirt and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. "The ledgers. They're real ones. Proof of everything. The murders, the land grabs, the bribes." She thrust it at him. "Take it. Run. Get it to the marshal in Prescott. They'll kill us both to get it back." He looked from the package to her face, illuminated by another muzzle flash from outside. He saw the terror she had been hiding, the crushing weight of the burden she carried. He wasn't just sheltering an outlaw. He was protecting the one person who could bring down an empire of greed. He pushed the ledgers back into her hands. "We'll get it there together," he said, his voice strained with pain but utterly resolute. "Now tie this arm up. They're coming again." His decision, made in an instant of pain and revelation, sealed their fate. It was no longer his ranch he was defending. It was her, and the justice she carried in that small, precious package. The fight raged on, growing more desperate. The attackers, realizing they couldn't flush them out with bullets alone, resorted to a more primal weapon. A flicker of orange light appeared near the barn. Fire. "The barn!" Amos rasped, his voice tight with fury and pain. He saw it through a crack in the boards, a torch being thrown onto the dry timber of the barn's wall. His barn. The one he had built with his own 2 hands, post by post, beam by beam. It held his tools, his hay, his future. They were burning his world down to get to her. A cold, hard rage settled over him, sharpening his senses. The pain in his arm faded to a dull throb. They were no longer just faceless threats. They were men destroying his life, and he would make them pay for it. "Cover me," Lynn said, her voice deadly calm. Before he could object, she was moving toward the back of the house. She slipped out the small root cellar door, a black-clad wraith melting into the deeper shadows outside. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. He laid down a steady covering fire from the front window, drawing the attacker's attention, giving her the seconds she needed. He counted the shots, his mind a frantic calculator of time and risk. The flames on the barn grew higher, painting the night in hellish shades of red and orange. He saw figures moving in the firelight, emboldened, closing in on the house. Then, from the darkness on their flank, Lynn's rifle spoke. One shot. A man cried out and fell. Another shot. A second man dropped his torch and crumpled. She was a ghost of vengeance, moving along the fence line, using the very structures he had built as her cover. She was precise, economical, deadly. The attackers, caught in a crossfire, fell into confusion. Their organized assault dissolved into panicked, sporadic shooting. From inside, Amos took his own toll, his rifle bucking against his good shoulder. They were a team, a two-person army holding back the night. He saw a man breaking from cover, running toward the side of the house where Lynn was. He was raising his pistol, aiming into the shadows where she had to be. "Lynn, left!" Amos roared. He fired through the window, the shot going wide. But his warning was enough. Lynn spun, firing from the hip. The man went down, but he got a shot off as he fell, a shot that echoed too loud in the sudden quiet. Amos saw her stumble. He saw her go down to one knee, her rifle clattering on the hard-packed earth. A profound, icy terror seized him, worse than any fear he had felt for himself. He forgot the other shooters, forgot the fire, forgot everything but her. He was halfway to the door before he caught himself, realizing he would be cut down in the open. The remaining attackers, their nerve broken, began to fall back, melting into the darkness. The immediate danger was over, the siege was broken, but the cost was only now being counted. The orange glow of the burning barn cast a sickly light over the yard as Amos burst out of the house. The air was thick with smoke and the bitter smell of defeat. He found Lynn leaning against the fence line, trying to push herself up. Her left leg was soaked in blood. He reached her side, his hands gentle as he helped her. "It's just my leg," she said through gritted teeth, a testament to her sheer will. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He swept her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest despite the iron in her soul. She didn't protest, her body slumping against his in exhaustion and pain. He carried her back into the bullet-riddled house and laid her carefully on the table. He lit a new lantern, its steady flame pushing back the shadows. The room was a wreck, splintered wood, shattered glass, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. In the center of the chaos, he focused only on her. He cut away the fabric of her trousers with his knife. The wound was ugly, a deep tear in the muscle of her thigh. It was bleeding badly. He worked quickly, his hands, usually occupied with the tools of building and mending, now tasked with saving a life. He pressed a clean cloth to the wound, his touch firm and steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "Hold this. Hard," he commanded. She did, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, beaded with sweat, but her eyes never left his. They were wide with a vulnerability he had never seen before. The warrior was gone, and in her place was just a woman, hurt and afraid. He fetched whiskey and a needle, his movements economical and sure. He cleaned the wound as gently as he could, ignoring her sharp intake of breath. He didn't have the skill of a doctor, but he had the practical knowledge of a man who had patched up himself and his animals more times than he could count. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice low. "I know," she whispered. As he stitched the wound closed, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by her quiet, ragged breaths and the distant crackle of the dying fire in his barn. The pain of his own arm was a forgotten echo. All that mattered was the woman on his table, the life he was holding together with clumsy, determined stitches. When he was finished, he wrapped the leg tightly. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of his hand, a gesture of pure, unconscious tenderness. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment. "Thank you," she breathed, the words barely audible. He pulled a chair close to the table and sat down, his rifle across his lap. He watched her breathe in the flickering lamplight. The war was over for the night, but the quiet aftermath was where the real truth lived. He had seen her at her most formidable and her most fragile. He had watched her fight for him, and he had patched her back together. She was no longer a stranger he had offered a job. She was Lynn. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let anyone harm her again. Dawn arrived pale and gray, filtering through the smoke that still hung heavy in the valley. The light revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin, still smoldering. The yard was littered with brass cartridges and the dark stains of blood. The house itself was scarred, pockmarked with bullet holes, a testament to the battle they had survived. Amos stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in his good hand, and surveyed the wreckage. It was his home, his life's work, and it was nearly destroyed. He should have felt despair, a crippling sense of loss. Instead, he felt a strange calm, a quiet resolve. He had lost a building, but he hadn't lost what mattered. He turned as the door creaked open. Lynn stood there, leaning heavily on a rifle she was using as a crutch. Her face was drawn with pain, but her eyes were clear. She looked out at the devastation, her gaze lingering on the smoldering barn. "I'm sorry, Amos," she said, her voice hoarse, "for all of this." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes on the horizon. "It's just wood. Can be rebuilt." He looked at her then, at her bandaged leg, at the exhaustion she couldn't hide. "Wood is easier to fix than people." She hobbled over to stand beside him, the two of them looking out at the ruins of their battlefield. A fragile peace settled over them, the kind that only comes after surviving a storm together. "We drove them off," she said, more to herself than to him. "But they'll be back. Thorne, the man who was shouting, he doesn't give up." "Then we'd best be ready," Amos said simply. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "First, we get those ledgers to Prescott. Then we rebuild." The "we" hung in the air between them, solid and real. It wasn't a question or an offer anymore. It was a fact. Their lives were now intertwined, their fight a shared one. A rare ghost of a smile touched Lynn's lips. It was a small, tired thing, but it transformed her face. "You're more trouble than a whole herd in a lightning storm, rancher." "You could have let me dance alone," he countered, a hint of dry humor in his own voice. It felt good to breathe, to speak of something other than survival. It was the sound of the world starting to turn again. She looked at him, her dark eyes holding an emotion he couldn't quite decipher, but it was warm. "No," she said softly, "I couldn't have." The admission was quiet, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. In the shared light of a new day, surrounded by the evidence of what they had lost, they had found something unshakable. He nodded, accepting her words, accepting this new reality. "We'll need new timber for the north wall of the house," he said, turning the conversation back to the practical, the tangible. It was how he knew to show he understood. It was how he knew to show he cared. Weeks passed. The valley slowly began to heal, and so did they. Amos made the perilous journey to Prescott alone, riding hard for 2 days. He left Lynn at the ranch, fortified and armed, a grim trust passing between them as he departed. He delivered the oilskin package and his testimony to a territorial marshal who, for once, was an honest man. Investigations began. Warrants were issued. The Black Creek Mining Syndicate, with its foundation of corruption, began to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. The immediate threat to their lives receded, replaced by the slow, arduous work of rebuilding. They worked side by side from sun up to sundown. They cleared the debris of the old barn. They felled timber from the high country, and Amos, with Lynn's help, began to raise a new frame. Her leg healed, leaving a jagged scar she wore without comment. His arm mended, the pain a dull memory. The physical work was cleansing, a way to reclaim the valley from the violence that had scarred it. Their silences were different now. They were comfortable, filled with an easy understanding that required no words. They learned the rhythms of each other's presence, the dip of his shoulders when he was tired, the slight upturn of her mouth when something pleased her. The armor she had worn for so long began to fall away, piece by piece. The constant tension in her shoulders eased. She no longer scanned the horizon with the eyes of the hunted, but with the quiet appreciation of someone who was finally home. He found her one afternoon watching the horses in the corral, a genuine softness in her expression. He had never seen her look at anything with such peace. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden rays across the newly framed barn, they sat on the porch steps, as they often did. The air was cool, the world quiet. Amos handed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing against hers. The small touch was electric, a spark in the twilight. She didn't pull away. He didn't look at her, just stared out at the mountains, his profile stark against the fading light. "You're not a stranger," he said, the words coming out rough, as if they'd been carved from wood. "Not anymore." Lynn looked at his hand, the calloused, capable hand that had asked her to dance, that had stitched her wound, that was helping to rebuild a life for them both. "No," she agreed, her voice soft. "I'm not." There were no grand declarations, no flowery speeches. There was only this: a shared cup of coffee on a porch of a bullet-scarred house, a new barn rising against the sky, and two people who had found each other in the crucible of a fire. He had offered a dance to a lonely woman. She had accepted, and in doing so they had both found a place to stand, a reason to fight, and a quiet to call their own. They watched the last of the light fade, the horizon no longer a line of threat, but a promise of another day, together.